Hey, class. I want to say a couple of things briefly about the topic of white privilege, systemic racism. I think this is something we should talk about. Um, One of the things that I've heard around campus, pretty common actually, is that chapel or timeout or even church is not the place to talk about politics, right? We go to church to worship God, to be edified via scripture and the preaching of the word and through prayer. This is not a time to engage politics. On one hand, I agree if chapel or church told you who to vote for, told you what propositions to vote yes or no on, right? I don't want to engage politics from a Republican perspective or a Democrat perspective. So in that way, I would agree. But where I disagree and where I really want to challenge you as future pastors is that the church at all levels have to address the core issues of our day, the moral issues that our society is engaged in. And right now, one of those issues is racism, racial injustice, protests, violence. We can't stay silent because that's not a political issue related to Republicans or Democrats. That's a moral issue related to our history as a country, our history as a church. And so we've got to be courageous. Pastors have to find ways to engage these topics. We need to do it humbly. We need to be wise and thoughtful, but we can't ignore them. We've got to have courageous conversations and courageous sermons. The second thing that I want to say is that when students, when people in general in the United States, white people, hear the term white privilege, for many it creates defensiveness. There's an immediate reaction, and I think what your thought process is, those of you that feel defensive about the term white privilege, is I think what you're thinking is, do I have to feel guilty about being white? Is it bad to be white? Am I experiencing some kind of reverse racism when someone talks about white privilege? So from my perspective, no. I am a white man. I do not have to feel guilt about being white. I don't have to feel shame about being white. I didn't do anything. It was out of my control. I was born to white parents, right? I can't do anything about that. I have done nothing overtly, right, to manage privilege or to hoard it, but I inherited it. I inherited white privilege. So I'm not going to feel guilt or shame because it's something I inherited and it's not something that I did, but I have it. It's real in my life. I have privilege. So the question is not, should you feel guilt or shame about being white, but recognize we have lots of privileges because of the color of our skin, and we're called to do something with that privilege. In the Bible, blessing, you are always blessed to be a blessing to others, right? It's not so that you can hoard it for yourself. The history of racism in our country, right? Slavery, yes. Segregation, yes. But even overt policies into the 60s, 70s, and 80s made it so that people of color could not own homes, did not have access to the GI Bill, even if they served in the military. They were redlined into certain neighborhoods that then were over-policed. There was a lack of jobs and transportation. Overt racist policies in our past created disadvantage for people of color and created great advantage or privilege for those that were white. So white folks could buy homes, own land, accumulate wealth. We can see white privilege in all kinds of data points. The average black family in the United States has 10% of the wealth of the average white family. 10%. Well, of course, if you couldn't own land, if you couldn't vote until the 1960s, if you've had very little political power, corporate power, and land ownership, you're going to have a lot less wealth. The political powers of our country even now are dominated by white men, so there's privilege there. The criminal justice system, 1 in 5 black men will be wrapped up in the criminal justice system at some point. It's 1 in 22 white men. So if you're a person of color, you're much more likely to be wrapped up in the criminal justice system than you are if you're white. That's privilege. The education system, educational outcomes are much better for white individuals than people of color. Every major system in our country has better outcomes on average for white individuals than black individuals, right? So there is privilege with being white. There is real privilege. If I took you and dropped you into a random white body in the US, you have a much better chance of having access to opportunity and resources and power and wealth than if I dropped you into an average person of color in their life. Now that doesn't mean every white person is poor, and that doesn't mean every white person has lived a great life and has had no struggles. There are many white people who are poor and many white people who struggle. There's no question about that. But white individuals have not had to endure the historic and systemic racism that people of color have had to. That there are real causes for poverty, for the issues of education and the criminal justice system that we see regarding people of color. And so as a white individual who has not had this adversity, who has not had to face this history of racism in the country, I have great privilege, and as a Christian, I want to use that to the best of my ability to empower others, to give voice to the voiceless, to lift up those who have been marginalized and oppressed, and to do the work of God in the world. And that's my challenge to you. Now, some of you might disagree with what I'm saying. That's okay. We're going to talk about this in class, and I hope we have a very rich dialogue filled with a kind of humility and a willingness to listen and engage.